This is Rowan Howard. I'm talking to Rita McCarthy. We are at her house at 363 Gibbs Avenue, and the date is March 16th, 1984. Rita, you were about to tell me about your childhood here in Newport. I know you were born here, and your mother came from Ireland.
Yes, she did, when she was less than 2 years old. And I always had a great interest in what they did and why did they come to Newport. And she told me that a relative of my grandfather's came before them, and he wrote back apparently and told them it was a land of opportunity or something here. And so they landed in Canada, and my grandmother waited to have a baby before she came, and it turned out to be twins, and one died. And they came with 9 children and a neighbor's child, and they landed in Canada, and then they came down to Newport, and they settled here, and they lived on Callender Avenue. My mother said in those days it was really quite a nice street. Yeah. It's beginning to be nicer now.
That's right.
And it's strangely enough, she had so many neighbors on Callender Avenue that when my mother married in 1907, they bought a house on Arol Street, and it was the Vernon House. It was built by the old Newport, by the Vernon family. Yeah. And my mother bought the house, my mother and father bought the house there. It had 6 bedrooms. It was a big house. And next door was Charlie Johnson and his famous son, Van Johnson, the movie star.
Right.
And then the next door to them was John Howard Benson, the famous calligrapher, or is that what he was? And sculptor and painter. Yeah. And he was charming always. He had the loveliest mother and father, and they were lovely people. And up the street we had Mayor Sullivan, Mortimer Sullivan, who was mayor in Newport the longest of anybody. And then next door to him was Judge Max Levy and his family. And at that time, I think he was the only judge that we had around here. And but Newport was a lovely place to grow up in. And when I was young, people used to say it's a lovely place to bring children up in and to retire in. But I think as time has gone on, right now I think that Newport has a lot to offer young people. There's lots of new businesses springing up all over, so it isn't quite like that. Years ago they had to go away and find their place in life and then come back when they wanted to retire. But anyway, I was brought...
I want to see if is it blinking? Yes.
As I say, I was brought up on Arol Street, and we had a lovely childhood, wonderful friends, and we used to go to Newport Beach all the time, and I went to the public schools, Cranston Calvert and John Clark, and then I only went 2 years to Rogers, and then I transferred to New York, and I graduated from St. Catherine's Academy there, and I took a business course for a year, and then we came back to Newport. And this was, I guess, the Depression times. I graduated in 1931, so I did see a lot of the Depression in New York. You know, apples sold on the corner, and the soup. At my school was a convent Catholic school, and they used to stand in line in the soup kitchen, which we never saw in Newport. I really don't think the Depression hit Newport like it did in big cities, and I think maybe it was because if we were at a mill town, like I think Fall River must have been severely hit, but we didn't seem to be, that I could recall, and people managed. I often look back and think of how cheap prices were in those days when I got married in 1937. I used to buy a porterhouse steak for 29 cents a pound and 5 dozen eggs for $1. It's just amazing. And you were still able to save money. It was amazing. But I always enjoyed, my father worked as a chauffeur for Mrs. Gustav White, and then later became superintendent of, she had 2 houses up there, one where Perry Belmont lived at the corner, and then 28 Greeno Place, and he was up there, and he lived to a wonderful old age of 86, and I hated to part with him. He was in such good health when he died, but he lived with me for 5 years prior to dying. My mother had died 5 years before then he came. But I was always interested in the summer colony. And
let me pause this because your tea's getting cold and so is mine. And tell me some more about Gustav White.
Oh, he was, unfortunately, you tell me you didn't remember him. Well, he was the handsomest man and full of charm. I always said he charmed the birds off a tree. And he was a very, very, he had a great deal of wit, and he was very, very intelligent. He graduated from Oxford, but he spoke 7 languages, could read, write, and converse in them. And he was his name was Gustav John Schirmer White, and he came from the John Schirmer family, was his uncle. And he was an accomplished musician, and his family, having owned the John Schirmer Publishing Company, music publishing in New York, and he was a music critic for years before he married Miss Fanny Jones, and her mother was Mrs. Lewis Quentin Jones. They lived over on Halladen Avenue. They owned that house where Francis Brooks lived, and now Mrs. John Nicholas Brown owns it across the street. I think she bought it for her daughter and the Fishers. But they had a wonderful marriage because they were both very musical. Mrs. White had a lovely voice and everything, but he was he was a very successful man in the real estate business, as you might remember. And then they had wonderful auctions, and the women used to come, I think, just to look at him. and he, as I say, was. Oh, and I always remember another thing about Mr. White too was as we approach these parades that come with all these, Memorial Day and whenever we have them. In my day, they had these wonderful parades. Of course, we had the Navy here then, and they had, loads and loads of sailors, and mostly sailors and all these. But they were always led by these handsome men. Really, I thought they were chosen by their looks because it was Mr. White, and he'd be on a horse in his naval uniform, and it would be Governor Vanderbilt in his uniform, and Mr. William Fitzhugh Whitehouse in his uniform, and his brother Norman Whitehouse. And oh gosh, if I could think of them, but they used to lead the parade down the avenue.
And so naval uniforms, army uniforms, or whatever.
Mr. White was Navy, and I think Mr. Whitehouse was Army, but I'm not sure. But they wore these glorious uniforms full of all kinds of, decorations.
Oh, wow.
And they made such a spectacular appearance going down the avenue in these glorious horses. It was wonderful. And as I say, I used to love to, and I had a great interest in the summer people, and so that I knew them by sight, if not to speak to a lot of them. And I always remember going to the casino, always to the tennis matches, and we were discussing here before I started this of how lovely the ladies dressed, and so did the gentlemen in those days. You never saw anybody in shorts or slacks or anything. The ladies had these beautiful afternoon gowns on and big hats. The gentlemen always had, I think you call them boaters, do they call them? Those straw hats with the band, and and of course I used to just drool over looking at like Howard Cushing and his wife. They were the handsomest couple, and they had 4 children, and they started to appear, and those children were gorgeous too. Somehow or other, all of those lovely wealthy people were very good looking. But it was wonderful to see them, and then we were discussing they would have tea parties, and very often the local people were invited, like Miss Wetmore would have one, and various people. Robert Gillette would give a party once in a while, and he would invite the townspeople, and of course that was a big day for us to go, and I just loved looking at them. They were all so beautiful, the beautiful people, the BPs, and I also like to remember their beautiful estates. They took great pride in their sidewalks, which I miss today. When you'd go down the avenue and go around the drive, the sidewalks were manicured like their lawns, and that isn't so. I don't know why, but they did. I guess help was easier to come by in those days or something, but it was lovely to look at the going down. And another great tradition when I was a young girl The ladies used to go for a drive in the afternoon in their limousine, and very often they had open touring cars and big hats and parasols, and they would stop at the various estates and leave a calling card. And a lot of the ladies had chauffeurs and footmen who'd be sitting up there. Oh, they wouldn't dare as much as look at you or sneeze. But they would go around the Ocean Drive every afternoon, as you could tell time by them. And they'd all go around. It was just lovely. And it was sort of a gracious way of living. And then they had lovely debutante balls. And when I got old enough, we would go down very often in the summertime if somebody was having a party. We'd go down to see them driving in. And you know, nobody tried to crash or anything. You'd stay across the street and just see the cars come along, and you could see them in the back, and it was very glamorous to see them so, and they wore all their jewels and everything, and it was just wonderful to watch them. And you'd hear the music, and nobody ever, to my knowledge, ever tried to crash. And people were not destructive either in those days. It's sad, and I grew up with the house without a key. We never had a key to our front door, and it was a lovely way of living. Unfortunately, that seems to have been
When do you think all of that sort of came to a halt, Rita? Was it World War II that was the end of that, or?
The first time I saw things, to my way of thinking of changing, was the Jazz Festival. I sort of, that was a shocking time when people had all kinds of wild stories about the sleeping on the beach and the dancing around, with the bonfires. And that, to my way of thinking, was the beginning of I don't know whether dope came into it at that time or what. I think dope has a lot to do with this, the way they behave. Got to have some excuse for their bad behavior and bad manners. They had beautiful manners years ago, and they were very gracious, everybody. So were the townspeople that you knew. But times have changed. I don't mean that a lot of them, thank goodness I have a lot, most of my friends, or all of them, to my way of thinking, are great and charming and lovely, but there's a great change in life. But I think Newport has changed a lot for the better, a lot for the worse. I like to, when I go down Thames Street, I think that's an improvement. Years ago you walked down there and it was saloon after saloon.
Well, yes, if you were allowed to walk down
yes, that's right. You were not allowed, exactly. But I felt sorry last summer one night after coming from dinner. A group of us said, have you ever been downtown on the height of the season? And we hadn't, so there were 6 of us in the car. So one of the husbands drove us down, and I couldn't believe it. It was like a zoo. The people were all over the street and so terribly dressed in scanty clothes. And I don't like to see so many young people pouring out of a bar, hanging all over it. It was, I was disappointed to see what I saw. But I think that Dallas Duke has done a wonderful job in Newport with those houses. I think over at the Point, you go various places, not the Point, the Historic Hill and all those places. She did a wonderful job. And I think the music festival is a great addition to Newport. There's a lot of wonderful things, and of course when the torpedo station closed, everybody thought we were going to fold up. I think that's when tourism took over. And I'm not crazy about Newport being packed jammed. I remember it when we could drive leisurely any place, but today, especially mostly in the summertime when it's bumper to bumper, but that's progress, they say, and the bridge is to blame. But I don't know. I suppose it wouldn't help financially to have things the way that we had them when we were young. But I think that so many people, and I'm disappointed to see so many condominiums going up all over. I wonder what they'll look like 10 years from now.
It bothers me too, because anybody living in a condominium, particularly time-sharing, doesn't care about the city at all, and they're not going to be contributed in any way to Newport.
And you only own a little piece of the land, in some of these kind of. I hated to see them go up over at Moreland Farm, on that. It was a beautiful. I hate to look up when I'm over there around the Newport Country Club and see them. and around Weldon's place. It's just sad, you know. But I don't know when they're going to call a halt to all this, but it's a little too much.
Maybe a little too late.
Too late.
Rita, going back to your schooling, and you said you went to New York. Your whole family went down.
We went down, yes. Mr. White, he had his own business here, Gustav White Insurance, real estate insurance, and he was very friendly with a Harry Black, his name was, and he was a very, very wealthy multimillionaire, and he owned great big skyscrapers in New York, and so he somehow or other persuaded Mr. White that he ought to be in New York, and he got him this wonderful job with the Fuller Construction Company, and so Mr. White was so excited over this big, big job, so down he went, and he tried it out for a couple of months, and he wanted everybody with him, so down we all went, and Mr. White only lasted 2.5 years. He hated New York, and he missed his golf and his horses. He used to go, in those days, he'd go horseback riding down Ruggles Avenue with old Mr. Prince. I used to see them when I go by all the time. We'd go down and feed the horses sugar and everything, and he had a couple of horses there and out at Bill Vanderbilt's estate, and he missed it terribly, and he said life wasn't worth living like that. So back we came after, but I was able to go to New York, stay in school for and it was a nice experience for me. And I loved New York at the time. Today, when I go down, I haven't got that feeling for it anymore.
That's changed.
It's that too has changed. But it was fun. So then we came back here, and I got married. I worked for Mr. White up in his office for 5 years, and then I got married. And when my husband died in 1960, I thought he was sick for a few years before. I thought it's time I did something, made some plans for the future. And I had done secretarial work for Mr. White up there, so the Lord is good. And one day, both out of the blue, he called me up and said that Miss Pauline Weaver, who was the only social secretary in Newport, that she was very sick in the hospital, and that she had been taking care of Mrs. Moulton, Arthur Moulton, who lived at the corner of Ruggles and Bellevue Avenue, Belmead. And so he said she needed a secretary very badly. Did I have any free time? So I said, well, I'd make time. And I had 3 little boys. Well, not little. They were 3 boys. My oldest son had just graduated from Providence College and gone into the Marines, so I mustn't say little. But the youngest one was Bill must have been about 12 or 13. So, however, I went to Mrs. Moulton, and we hit it off like 2 peas in a pod, and she was charming, and I was crazy about her, and so finally Miss Weaver got well enough to come back, and I had rather a nice letter from her, which I think I kept, and said that she was glad Miss Weaver was better, but she was sorry to lose me, and she said, hang on in case. So while I was with her, Maxim Karalik was visiting, was there for dinner one night, and said how desperate he was. So she said, well, she had a new secretary, and so he called me up. And I had a funny story about that. He called me up to one day to ask me, and we always knew who he was. We saw him around, and I remember going to the Art Association to concerts when he sang. I thought they were atrocious, but I really didn't know much.
That's right.
And so we used to be amused at him, and so he was really a very, very nice gentleman, though. But however, he called up this day in his broken Russian accent, and with the paper there. So he said, Mrs. McCarthy, in very broken English, and I said, yes. He said, this is Maxim Karalik. And I don't know why. My husband never, ever, to my knowledge, ever called up and said he was anybody or did that. But somehow or other, it was at a time that he would call me up to say whether he'd be home at 12 or 12:30. I looked at the clock as the phone rang, and I thought it was my husband. And so when he said it was Maxim Karalik, I said, how are you, Maxie, old boy? And so there was dead silence, and it didn't click with me. And I said, and what can I do for you? And he said, well, I heard that you've been doing secretarial work for Mrs. Moulton, and she's very pleased with you. And I said, of course, why not? Well, this conversation went on. I don't know what was the matter with me, but it took quite a while with me making these side remarks before I realized this is Mr. Carolick. And then, yes, he is without a secretary. Oh, I said, Mr. Carolick, terribly sorry. I stammered and said, he just thought, ha, but he didn't sound overjoyed. And so he had made a date with me to come, say like Monday at 5 o'clock, at 10 o'clock in the morning or something. So I said, all right, well, anyway, I hated to face him. Oh, God, when I went up there. And so he was very nice, and he came in and shook hands with me. I think, of course, the subject never came up, but, I told the butler about it, and he laughed and everything. He said, he's really a good egg. He said he probably was amused. I wasn't so sure, but however, I stayed with him until he died. Oh. And it's amazing how one led to another. Then Mrs. Harold Brown heard that I was doing it, and she called me up, and I was crazy about her. Everyone I worked for I've liked, and I went to her, and she was a charming lady. And actually, she was a rather a lonely person, and she used to reminisce and talk about her life and times, because that was right up my alley. I just loved listening to those stories, and so I had a lovely time with her. And then she sent me to Mrs. Gillespie, who was her half-sister. Mm-hmm. And so I was with Mrs. Gillespie until she died.
Gracious.
And I'll miss her to the day I die, because we had a lovely rapport, and I used to look forward to going down there, and we'd get there. I'd get there at 6 o'clock. She was a night person, and I'd get there at 6 o'clock, and she'd wait for me, and we'd have tea, and she said, we would chew the rag. So we'd have tea, and she took the greatest interest in my life, and she would listen to me like it was the most interesting thing she ever heard. She listened to everything, and she was just a charming, lovely, and I tell you, we could all take a page out of her book. I never heard her say an unkind thing about anyone. Wow. Had a sweet, lovely nature. It was lovely. And she had 2 daughters that had the greatest natural affection for their mother that I've ever witnessed. No put on or anything. They were just lovely to her. And it almost was like, I used to look at them and think, she'd tell me stories of her mother, mm-hmm. and how devoted she was. And it was like history repeating itself. That they must, and I think that's rather interesting in life, that they saw their grandmother being treated this way, and they certainly treated her. She was never alone to the day she died. Yeah. It was lovely. Yeah. So, but everyone I've worked for, I've enjoyed. The one that amused me most, do you remember Mrs. Harold Brooks?
Don't remember now.
Oh, she was amusing. She lived over in Halladen Avenue, and where I told you that was Mrs. Lewis Quentin Jones's house, and she was over there. She was a party girl, if ever there was. She had no children, and I'd go over, and all I'd do for her was write letters, and then if she had a party, I'd write the place cards for her and things like that at the table. But her letters were so amusing, and she had I've never known anyone with so much correspondence, all personal letters. And she was an operator. She would write to Danny Kaye. She knew all the theater people, and she knew, anybody that was anyone, she knew them. And style, she was only about 5'1". She was very petite, little teeny feet, and she loved everything that was in vogue. She loved any new dance came out. She went and took lessons immediately, so she would know how. She always had a lot of young friends, and I think she was quite old at the time when I knew her. She was around. But she was always, she used to write to people, and she'd say, whether it's right or wrong, I was born to entertain and be entertained. You began to feel sorry for this poor lady. This was your life. But she entertained with a great flair, and she used to write to, take Danny Kaye. She'd write to him, and his wife's name was Sylvia. That would be Darling, Danny, and Sylvia and Danny, and she'd say, I wonder if you're going to, this would be in June, I wonder if you're going to be in New York around November the 29th. Well, I wouldn't know how I'd feel November 29th, but she would be, I wonder how, if you'll be in New York around the 29th, I want to give dinner party for you and Sylvia, and I'll have lots of attractive people. And so she said, and young. And so she said, and I want very much to have it's for you and Sylvia, the two of you. So in due time, he would write back and say, oh, that's very exciting. Yes, we do expect to be in New York. So then she would start her party in June. And she'd get all the people she wanted. And of course, poor Danny and Sylvia would be at the party, but they ended up entertaining.
Yeah, sure.
So her parties were very successful. Yeah. And she said to me one day, I want to give you a little advice. And the music festival was in town, and it was it was the time it was in the early days of it, and they had it like on a barge, didn't they, on Wellington Avenue, or Ida Lewis Yacht Club or something, and they had a music festival or opera or something there, and they had these opera singers, so she was a great one for entertaining and everything, and after the festival, she invited them all back to her house for a party. So the next time I used to always question them about how their parties went and what did you eat and what did this and did you enjoy it. They'd tell me. I would have a great talk. So when I saw her, I said, well, how did your party go? She said, well, I want you to know that it was the biggest flop of a party I ever gave. And she said, let me give you a little bit of advice. And I said, oh, what's that? Well, she said, if you have any unattractive friends or fat ones, don't ever invite them to dinner. And I said, she said, men are men the world over, and they don't give a GD if you can sing or what you do, as long as you've got a pretty face and a pretty shape. So she said, don't bother having them to your parties. I said, well, I don't feel that way at all. I said, isn't it funny, if I like someone, I don't know whether they're beautiful or homely or what they are. Well, she says, get wise. Don't have them to lunch. So I used to kid my friends and say, well, I'm going to have you to lunch. But they had very funny, she was very amusing, and she would have, designers send her, 10 or 15 sketches of gowns, and she could look at them, and I could look at them, and I couldn't see anything in them, but she could, and she'd write a glowing letter back how glorious they were, and she'd order all these clothes, and she loved everything that came out new in fashion. And it would take me 2 or 3 years before it caught on. But she was very entertaining, and I enjoyed her very much.
Would you write all the letters for her? She did that to you?
So, but she had a correspondence like you wouldn't believe, and it was always to some very, very well-known person, or somebody in the theatrical world, or musical world, or politics. She knew them all.
She would go back to New York in the winter,
yes.
Obviously.
Oh, and then they traveled, and I went to New York. Speaking of Mr. White, he was a wonderful friend to me, because, you see, he actually used to tell people he knew me before I was born, because my father worked for Mrs. White, and matter of fact, my father was their best man when they got married. She had been married before. And then when she married Mr. White, she didn't like him at first. She used to tell my father so. She didn't, but he pursued her, and then they got married, and they really had a wonderful marriage. And my mother lost her first child, 4.5 years old, and I had a brother who's a retired colonel in the Marines, and then I was next. And Mrs. White and Mr. White always used to come over to the house to see us as we were children, and they always were very, very intimate with the family. And then I went to work for Mr. White after I came back to New York, and I was there, as I told you, 5 years. And then Mrs. White died. I think she must have died. I don't know if she must have died, I think sometime in the 50s, 55 maybe, and my husband died in the around 56 or 57 she died, and I never knew anybody to grieve over his wife, because they had no family, no children, and he grieved a great deal over Mrs. White, and he had a stroke, and I always thought he brought it on with this terrible grief he had, and the poor man lost the whole use of his left side and never regained the use of his left hand. And that was very sad, because one thing he had was his music. And that was really taken from him, and he used to lift his left hand up and put it on a chord on the piano and then play with his right hand. It was rather sad, but it sounded all right.
Yeah.
But he had great courage to do it, and his left leg was quite stiff. But Mrs. White never liked to travel. She hated airplanes, and she hated ships. So they were confined to just driving every place. So after she died, he had been very familiar with Europe and had gone to school there. And he was born in Munich, Bavaria, actually. And so he knew an awful lot about Europe. So he started going over, and he had a trained nurse with him all.
Okay.
I think where I left off was that Mr. White had asked me to go to Europe with him, and my husband had died in July of 1960, and Mr. White asked me to go that fall, probably in September or October, and I felt it was too soon. I just didn't feel in the mood for it. And believe me, I used to say my prayers every night that God would spare him for another invitation. Yes, you don't get those very often. No. And so he said, well, I'll ask you again. And so, as I say, I prayed that he'd be kept alive for more reasons than one. I was very fond of him. And so anyway, come the following spring, he said, well, how about it now? So I said, yes. So he bought a brand new Thunderbird, and that was taken aboard the Leonardo da Vinci. And it took 9 days for us to get to Naples. And it was the most glorious trip I'll ever have, and I have been very fortunate to travel a lot since then. But that was an outstanding trip. And we stayed in Naples for, I think, 5 days, and we always had a balcony, and he'd sit out there, and we had his wheelchair, and he'd sit, and I drove him all over Europe. And so then this must be Cal.
There.
And I had to learn to drive all over Europe, and believe me, when we got off at Naples and I saw those little cars going every which way, my heart was in my mouth, but you can get used to hanging if you hang long enough, so I made up my mind I was over there, I was going to drive them, and that I did, and I'm happy to say that after 2.5 months, we came back on the Cristoforo Colombo without a scratch on the car, and I was very grateful. But he did one, it was a wonderful trip because how many people do you know that know Europe like Mr. White did? He knew Europe like I know Newport or going around here. And we started off from Naples after we were there 5 days, and we headed for Rome. And as we were driving along, we used to always bring a lunch in the car for, excuse me, Al. Yeah. Just have to off a minute. Yeah. Are we on? Uh-huh. We started out, as I said, from Naples heading for Rome, and Mr. White would be going along, and we always had a glorious lunch in the back of the car. He brought the best he knew wines, and we'd have cheese and fruit. I swore when I got home that's all I was ever going to eat for my lunch from now on, a crust of bread, a piece of cheese. But I forgot it after I got home. And so we started for Rome, and as we're going along, Mr. White said to me, now, Rita, pull over and watch for this road up here. And so we would go along, and so he'd say, this is it here now, and it would just be like a dirt road off. Now pull down there, and so I'd go down, and now turn left here, and after a few directions, we were in a graveyard. And I said, heavens, what are we doing in here? He said, I'll show you. So we drive down here, so we pull down, and the next thing we're at Caruso's grave.
Oh, my goodness.
And so Mr. White was very emotional. I think people very often after they've had a stroke are that way. And so he had this, get out of the car, and we'd open up the trunk and take out the lunch. It was about lunchtime, and the glasses, and we had the whole equipment in the back of the car. And so then he would start singing some arias from Caruso's music, and the tears would be rolling down his cheek. It was really something. So, but that was the way our trip was, and we went all over. Got to Italy and had a audience with the Pope, and went all over. And it was amazing when I spoke of Mrs. Brooks. When I got to Paris, I said to Mr. White, how long are we going to be here? And he said, well, I think we'll probably be here a week. So Van Johnson knew I was going over. He has always kept up a correspondence with me, even to this day. And he and his wife and daughter were in London. They had a flat, as they call them. And he was doing The Music Man. And he was the most popular star you can imagine. They just, because that was a wonderful play. If you ever saw it, I loved it.
I did,
and he was great in it.
Sure.
And so anyway, I called Van up and said I was there, so he invited me over for 3 or 4 days, and Mr. White was delighted to have me go. He was wonderful. So I took a taxi to the airport, and I was waiting to get my plane to fly to London, and at the Orly airport, and I heard this great commotion coming into the, where you wait for the plane, and everybody sort of turned around. I couldn't believe it. I looked up. It was Mr. and Mrs. Brooks with an entourage of bellhop supporters carrying baggage like you've never seen. So when she saw me, she almost died. Oh, well, she gets so excited over me and everything. And we had a great reunion there, so I told her I was going over to London. Well, she didn't ask me who I was going to see, so I didn't venture any names or anything. So she was going first class, and I was just going as a regular passenger. So we parted there, and she got on the plane, and we flew to Paris. And when we arrived in Paris, we had to go through customs. And we were standing in customs, and the next thing, my name is hollered out all over the place. Is there a Rita McCarthy here? And so I identified myself. Well, it seems Van and his wife came down to meet me at the airport in a Rolls Royce, I'll have you know. And who's standing watching me but Mrs. Brooks? And of course, nobody loved those stars like she did. So anyway, I didn't have to show the customs anything, just go right through. They were so thrilled with having Van there. And so he took me in to an outside and got in his, and I saw the Rolls Royce because he knew I'd love all these things. And who comes out this way? And the crowd were mobbing him. And of course, I loved all that. I thought it was so exciting to see it. And so they were all mobbing him. And I got in the car, and he started to sign autographs. He was very gracious to all of them. By that time, Mr. and Mrs. Brooks came out, and they got into a bus that took them to and so it sort of did my heart good to wave to them from the rolls. So anyway, I had a lovely time, and I came back and went to Paris, and I started to go out on tours. And Mr. White always went to bed right after dinner, and every single night he dressed for dinner in a tuxedo and the patent leather slippers. Oh, he was something. And but he always went to bed right after dinner. And so I used to say, well, I think I'll try these nightclub tours. Well, I'm going to tell you, if you're a little girl from Newport and your first time in Europe, it took a little courage to do it. And you had to wear an evening gown when you went out. And that was the only thing I had to pay for, so I was very extravagant and took the deluxe tours. And so the first one I went on, they picked me up in Paris. We stayed at the Plaza Athénée, and they came by in the bus to pick us up. And so, I tell you, my heart was down to my feet. I thought, I've never done anything like this before. And so I went out and got on the bus, and there were just 2 men in the back, and I sat up near the front. And then we went from hotel to hotel and picked up by the time we went home that night, you knew them all by name, and you were singing, and I had a wonderful time. So it gave me great courage to do it then anytime, because you were perfectly safe, and they took you to all these wonderful places and Maxims, and so I had a lovely time. And I did it in any of the big cities when we were there, in Rome and Paris and all those places, but it was great. So he was certainly a wonderful friend.
yes, wonderful. I wonder what brought him over here in the first place. Any idea?
Mr. White? Oh, his family were from Massachusetts.
Oh, really?
And they were just traveling in Europe when he was born. And so he came back here. Then they sent him over to Oxford to go to college. And as a matter of fact, I think one of his classmates was the, what was his name? The big man in the church over in England. He died.
You mean the dean?
The,
Inge?
I should know his name, everybody.
What, the Red Dean?
I can't think what you call him. The head of the church in England.
The Archbishop?
The Episcopal Church. Well, he was his classmate, and so he went to Oxford with him. I can't think what his name is now, but I should. But however, it was a glorious trip.
Sounds marvelous. Rita, tell me about some parties today.
Oh, they give beautiful parties. I can remember the Harvey Firestones gave a beautiful party at the Elms about 20 years ago, maybe. It must be about 20 years ago. And I've never seen such decorations as she put in there. She had the men come from Akron to do the decorating, and she had roses. The stems must have been about 36 inches long. I never saw such roses in my life, gold and everything. The color was gold, and Tom Hageman had great taste, too, and he did the decorating, and he had gold tablecloths, and it was just the most beautiful party, and everybody, I think the parties are just as lovely today, and Janet Orton-Cross, I helped them with her debutante party, which was a beautiful party over at Hammersmith Farm, and then her wedding. And I think the people that I know and work for have beautiful manners, and their children have, and they live very graciously. I don't know that, I think some of the new breed that's come in are more casual, but those that I know, I think all have beautiful manners and lovely.
The old families are still coming back, and
I think so, yes. And I'm awfully happy that a lot of their children seem to be coming and settling here. They have lovely. They've all had beautiful parties. When you think of it's very good for the economy when you think of one of those parties costs. They've had. They still go an awful lot. I mean, I don't know how their system stands these parties or their life, but that's as Mrs. Brooks said, right or wrong, should born to entertain and be entertained. But and that is their life. But she's. They all seem to enjoy the dinner parties and the lunches.
I guess we're more conscious of the mansions that have been turned over to the Preservation Society.
I think that was a wonderful thing that Mrs. Warren did. She had great foresight when she started that. It's a good thing people don't ask my opinion of things like that, because when I heard about it, and she's another one that I used to do work for, and I was very fond of her. When I first heard of this having it open, I used to say, well, after a few years, who's going to go look at them? I thought we were going to run out of people. And then when I read statistics in the paper, I certainly had a great foresight. But I think it was wonderful what she's done, and I guess you see an awful lot of, one of the big problems with these big mansions today is to get help to take care of them. People don't go into domestic work anymore, and it's too bad in a way, because I personally think that if I needed a job and I didn't have any profession of any kind to do, I think it's a very nice way of living. You certainly learn the nice way of living, and you have good food, and you have a lovely home, and the people are very nice to you, your employers. And I think I'd rather do that than be, say, out at Warwick's working or someplace. But they have very nice living. But people don't do it today. Of course, I guess the whole thing is it's too confining.
The
hours are confining. And that makes it very difficult to manage one of these homes with help. It's a terrible problem trying to get someone to work, and of course the new generation aren't apt to be so condescending as our generation. But,
Rita, as secretary, you wrote letters and all. What else did you do? You said you wrote the place cards. Did you handle all
help
their
them with their dinners and what they were
planning
going to
them
have, and seating them is the biggest problem. You know, I think that's the secret of a good dinner is to have it well seated. And it takes a lot of time and thought and effort.
Well, you'd have to know pretty much who's who, wouldn't you?
And you have to be careful that he wasn't married to her, right? There's a lot of that, you know. But it's interesting. And I always like to hear after if they're happy with their seats. And I've even had some call me up and say, well, now, are you going to seat this dinner or that dinner? And, you know, I would like to sit next to so-and-so, or don't seat me next to this one. You know, it's interesting. But I guess if you go out as much as that, maybe you do like a change.
Yes, I guess so.
You probably run out of conversation with them.
Yes, if you're sitting next to the same
Too often.
Too often. When you were a little girl growing up, who'd you play with?
Oh, well, there was Norma Flutter, Matt and Clifford. They lived up the street. And the Fitzgerald family. John Fitzgerald is the city manager in Middletown, his family. And we had the Levy family. We always seemed to stick to those on our street. And we had Judge Sullivan's family. They were a little younger than I am, but I've grown up to still be friends with all these people, and it's nice. And we used to go to Newport Beach, and in those days, Newport Beach was very nice for the townspeople, and it was an attractive beach, and they had a lovely big pavilion there and I can remember Sundays they used to have an orchestra, and they'd play there, the ladies. We all dressed up and went down to Newport Beach, and oh yes, you waited for them to come out and see what they had on, and what was the name of that orchestra leader? Calabrese. And the ladies all were crazy about Calabrese. They had rocking chairs, and it was very attractively, you know, they had nice shrubbery and flowers around. And then another thing that amuses me is now with seasons, Labor Day was the day that the girls all wore their first fall dress. So you appeared at the beach, it could be 102 in the shade, and you wore a black dress and a black hat. I often think of it. You wore your first fall outfit. Now I wouldn't wear it until mid-October if necessary. But it was a very nice beach, and we enjoyed it up until, I guess, the hurricane changed. You know, that was it. And then I went over to Hazard Beach after that and stayed there. But that was a great beach to bring children up on. It was lovely. And they had a wonderful childhood over there. My middle son, when he went to Washington, he used to amuse all his friends with tales of his life growing up, and he felt very sorry for everybody else. Nobody else had a good time. And my oldest son would say, Mother, you ought to hear him telling people what he did. And he would look at them sort of, you poor things, you'd ever lived on a beach. And we used to take them over for breakfast in the morning, and there were about 4 or 5 of his families. We all had children, and they were all great friends. And we'd just go for breakfast in the morning, and we'd fry eggs on the beach and everything. And then by 2 o'clock, we used to go up. Somebody would be sent up to get pastry from Lynch's Bakery on Thames Street, and then we'd have coffee and pastry. And then the children would want to stay for supper, so a few of us would go home, and we'd come back with food for everybody. And we'd have, and that would go on. And they had really a great time. It was a lovely place for children, and they had a boat, and they fished, and they were never bored. You know, they always had something to do. So it was a nice way to grow up. And I remember the same with my life down at Newport Beach, having a wonderful time.
Do we have a seaweed then? always
but I
had
don't know.
seaweed,
I guess
didn't
it always
Yeah.
had seaweed, but I don't think we worried about it.
I don't remember worrying about it.
No. But Newport, I think, is a lovely place to live. It's comfortable and easy, and I think we're very fortunate here.
I think we are too. This is Rowan Howard. I'm interviewing Rita McCarthy here at her house at 363 Gibbs Avenue. This is March 28th, 1984. 26.
It's going quick enough.
It's okay. Rita, let's talk a little bit about you and your life and your husband and your kids. When did you and how did you meet your husband?
Well, like most all native Newporters, we kind of knew one another. I used to go to Newport Beach as a young girl, and I used to see Mac, as they called him, down there. But he was 9 years older than I was, and so I wasn't the least bit interested in him when I was. He was too old. But then, when I later got to know him and met him, then we started to go together. But we kind of knew one another, always knew who we were, and so we started to go together. And I went with him for, I guess, I thought I was too young to get married, and so I went with him for about 5 years.
Oh.
And then we got married in 1937. I was 22. Well, I was born in 14. You figure it out, Rowan.
14 to 32. 28?
Oh, no, 14.
No.
I was 14, 24, 34, 5, 36, 37. I was 22. And my birthday was October. I'd be 23 in October. And I got married in June of 1937, and had a big wedding, and the reception was at the Forge Cottage, which Connie Moore later bought at Turo Park. It was a lovely place for a wedding reception. They had a great, enormous glassed-in piazza, and so we had a lovely wedding. I think those are things that are nice to look back and remember. We have lots of lovely pictures of it. And then we had a lovely apartment at number 12 Summer Street. And it had long windows to the floor, and it was very attractive. And I was there for less than 2 years. Peter was born in 1938, my first one, in October of 38. And then, about 6 months later, I decided that we got to look for a house. And I used to drive around Newport myself during the day looking in the areas I liked. And I went by Dr. Haley's house at 40 Rhode Island Avenue. He lived in 42. There were two houses just alike, and I always liked them. So I happened to see it empty, so I rang Mrs. Haley's bell and said, "What are you doing with your house next door?" And she said, "Well, it's for sale." I said, "Well, it's for rent, rather." And I said, "Well, would you consider selling it?" And she said, "Maybe. Come back and talk to Byron." So we went back that night, and they gave us the key, and we went through it, and I loved the house. Had 4 bedrooms, and my mother said, "We really don't need 4 bedrooms with one child." So, but anyway, we made a deal and bought the house in 1939. And it was the year about, I guess it was about 38 or 39 we bought it. Anyway, I lived in it for almost 39 years I lived in it. And we bought this house 6 years ago. So, but, and I only wanted to be in this area. And 2 of my sons used to say to me, "It's time you got out of this house, Mother, and moved." The neighbors, Mrs. Haley, was getting along in years, and the other one at the corner, and he said, "There'll be, big apartments put in there, and you better get out before the area changes." So I said, "Well, find me a house, and I'll move." And they'd come back and say they'd found something over in Shadia Circle or something. I said, "No way, I want to be in the city." So anyway, I found this house, and I've been very happy here. But I had it, Newport's always been I'm very fond of it, very happy here, and I think it's a place that I never have anything but lots of nice, happy memories of growing up here. And we have nice friends and awfully good times together, and we did an awful lot together as families. Even when I look back on when I was a little girl, my mother, and father always included us and we'd bring friends, and we'd have picnics out in Saconnet Point, and we had a lot of company. I mean, my father was born in Westchester, New York, and he was one of about 9 children. And of course they loved Newport, and they came in the summer, and the New York boat was running in those days, and well, we had a very open house with 6 bedrooms and no key to the front door. It was fun to wake up in the morning, fun to us children. And we were getting to be teenagers, too, but we'd wake up in the morning and there'd be somebody in the guest room. And they'd come in and they'd say, well, we always know we're in the right house because we'd stop and listen in the hallway, and if we heard the snoring. And my mother and father both were good snorers. And, it was a wonderful way we lived, so casual and everything. But I look back and think how hard my mother did work, though, and she'd have all this company, and we thought it was great, but she did most, and she did all this cooking for them and entertaining for them, and she preserved all summer. I used to hate to see her take a ride in the country. She'd come back with bushel baskets of peaches, and I knew my day was cut out for me. I'd have to put them in hot water and pull the skin off them, and then she'd go get strawberries, and it was endless for tomatoes, and,
She put them all up?
She put them all up. I wouldn't put up a glass of water. I'd be afraid I'd get botulism from it because I'd never gone into it, but she did a beautiful job of it, and she used to be very proud of her cellar. You'd go down there and she'd have them all lined up with labels on them, and she was extremely generous with them. After all that, my work and hers, you came to visit, you went home with several jars.
Were you the only daughter? Really?
Yes, I had 2 brothers. And Marines seemed to run in my family. My oldest brother, Joe, he married a Newport girl, Eleanor Greatorix, and then he was in the Marine Corps. And he was out in the South Pacific on Johnston Island when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And we were in a panic because his wife was in Pearl Harbor with a little 7 or 8 months old little girl. And of course we didn't hear word of them for some time. And he fortunately got back into Pearl Harbor, and then she was sent home. And he stayed in the Marine Corps and retired as a colonel, and he has settled in Charlotte, North Carolina, with 9 children.
Oh, my son.
And I guess they're all married, but I think one. And his oldest daughter, unfortunately, lost her husband when they were married less than 10 years, and she had 6 babies. She's doing a beautiful job bringing them up, and it must be more than 10 years, and her time goes by, and she's done a beautiful job with them. And then my youngest brother, Harry, he went to Providence College, and then he went to, in the war, and he was overseas, and he went over that way. And then when the war was over, I guess before the war, before he went overseas, he was stationed. He was in the Army, and he was stationed out in the state of Washington. And he met his wife out there. She was from Toppenish, Washington, and they got married. And then he was sent overseas, and while he was gone, she had their daughter, firstborn. And then when he was sent back home, she was very smart, I thought, after, because we were kind of hoping, being old Newporters, that he'd come back. And if anybody was a real Newporter, Harry was. He adored it and everything, but it shows you how you can change. And he went to, when he came back from overseas, we had hoped she'd come and meet him here and bring the little girl, Jean. And she was awfully nice. While he was gone, she brought the little girl to Newport so my mother and father, all of us, could see her. And she had the child baptized here, and it was very nice. And then when Harry came home, we thought she was going to come again and then just settle here. So she knew that might very well be the plan, and she liked the West Coast. So she stayed home and said she thought it would be nice for him to see the family alone. And she later laughed about it and said, well, she knew that if she'd never get him back. So she stayed out there, and then, of course, he couldn't wait to go out and see her. And then he settled out there, and I think for 40 years he's been head of the Pharmaceutical Society for the state of Oregon. So he travels a great deal to the conventions, and I'm fortunate enough to see him. He comes he'll come in this area like Boston or Philadelphia, and he's in Washington a lot lobbying for various things, and he comes up, so I see him a lot. And I've been out there a couple of times, and he adores it.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people go out there.
Yes, he thinks, he's just crazy about it. And he tried to talk Mother and Dad into selling out and going out there. But however, he's very happy out there. And then when my oldest son, he went to Providence College, and when he graduated from there, he went in the Marine Corps during his last 2 years, or maybe, I'm not even sure if it's the last 2 or the whole 4 years while he was in the Marines. He was in the ROTC, as they call it, and then he, at graduation day, he was the only Marine, and they are all inducted into the Navy, but he was in the Marines, and he went in, and he loved it. And he's retired now as a colonel, and he's living in Washington, D.C., and he's young. You see, he's got his 20 years in, and he was in his early 40s, and so he thought it over and decided he was a late bloomer. He got married, I thought late, but he's got a little 8-year-old boy and a 2-year. So he said he wanted a home life. He didn't want to be traveling. So now he's working in Washington and loves it.
What's he working at?
He's with their Winthrop and Company. They sell tax shelters for very wealthy people. It's a very lucrative business, and he likes it very much, and he's doing very well with it, thank God.
Yeah.
Then Paul is my middle son, and he was in Washington he was a Marine, and then when he settled in Washington, and he had a bar there, the Aquarius, with another fellow, and it was very successful for quite a while, and then they had a lot of problems with, the neighborhood was changing, and so they had to, his partner pulled out, and then he tried to run it alone, and he decided the best thing was to give it up, and so he went out to California for a few months, I guess 6 months or so, and he rather liked it out there, but he had a bad back injury, and so he came home. I persuaded him to come home, and he's been home, and he's been happy ever since, so he's...
There. So Paul has just come home.
Oh, he came home, and he wasn't home any time when he got a job at White Horse Tavern, which he really loved, and he managed that for quite a while. But Paul's got a mind of his own, and he likes things done his way, and David Ray was awfully nice to him. Paul liked him, too. And then David, I think, was having problems, with the candy store and this one. So he somehow or other had he went to one of the islands, and he met this young man that was going to be a sort of a financial whiz and really put them both on their feet. And he came, and so he decided they shouldn't have linen tablecloths, and they shouldn't have it was going to be all paper. So Paul thought he was knocking down all the things that he wanted. So he decided that, no, he didn't want to work on and change his way he likes things done. So he quit the job, and then he finally opened his own bar and restaurant at the Munginger King. And he had it for 5 years, but the rent went up every year. And so he was working too hard and too much. He used to be, I don't know how he did it. He used to be there between 10 and 11 in the morning till 2 in the next. It was just terrible. So anyway, he saw it out, and so now he's down at the beach bar at the greenhouse. And he said he didn't want any job where he had any pressure, headaches, and he's very happy. And it's a temporary thing for him until something else develops. But and I'm happy to have him here with me.
Yeah, it's very nice to have one still
it
around.
Is.
Sure. Got cousins and things still around too, Rita?
Yes, we have some relatives. Not an awful lot, though, from, a big family. My mother's family seemed to have died. All her family, complete family, have died, and there are some cousins around, but not an awful lot of them. But what
did your father do for Gustav White? You said he was his manager?
Yeah, the chauffeur. Yeah. And then he worked for Mrs. White. And Mrs. White was married 3 times, and her first husband was Kip. And she had a son by him, Billy Kip. And then after she divorced him, she married Julian McCarthy, Little, McCarthy
Yeah.
Little. He was, his sister was Mrs. Reginald Norman,
Oh, yes, sure.
and he had a brother, Louis McCarthy Little, was head of the Marine Corps, commandant, and she married him, and then that marriage wasn't successful, and my father was working for her. He was born in Westchester, New York, and he worked for the Laurelard family. He was crazy about horses, and he used to teach horseback riding, and one of his favorite pupils was Elio Sears, who was a great athlete and a great walker, and she got great, had a lot of prestige, because she walked, I think, from Newport to Boston at one time, and she stayed here in Newport, I think in the Harriman house over here on Gibbs Avenue, but that was a great feat, but she was one of his pupils, and he taught her, and that was in, I think in Bernardsville, New Jersey. He must have been working for somebody that had horses, and then he used to help breed them and everything. He loved animals. Horses were his great favorite. He adored dogs, too, and so then he went with the Laurelard family, and they came to Newport, and then then they went back to Long Island or something, and then along the line he met Mrs. White, and her maiden name was Jones, Frances Foster Jones, and then she had been married, you see, to Kip, and then to Little, and then Dad met her, and she said the first time he went there to work, she said she heard him whistling in the yard. She said, I guess I'll get rid of him. I don't like people that whistle. And he was with her until she died. And she used to kid about it. But she was a wonderful friend to us, too. And she took great interest in us as a family. She used to come and visit me all the time. And she'd come in and say, let's change your room around, Rita. And we'd pull all the furniture. And I loved it. We'd pull all the furniture out and everything. And when I had the babies, she was always the first one over to see them, and she was really a very warm and friendly person. And as I told you then, when she met Mr. White, she didn't like him at first. She used to be trying to duck him and all this, and then all of a sudden, of course, they fell in love and got married, and my father was the best man.
So, wait. But I thought you said at one point he did more than chauffeuring. He was
after then Mrs. White had the two houses, so she said, I want you now to be the superintendent of and take care of seeing that both of them are two houses. So he would go for it. And he worked with Mr. White, and just taking care of the property, seeing to things like that and doing odd jobs and errands, I suppose, until he was 86 when he died. Wow. And then he died, and I think Mr. White died the year later, or maybe a year later. Dad died first.
How about your mother? Did she have a long life, too?
Yes, she did, but unfortunately 5 years before Mother died, she got quite senile, and as they call it, Alzheimer's disease now. But we never heard that in that day, but it's a terrible tragedy when it happens, because she was such a virile, active person and loved life and everything. But she lived to be, I think, about 79. But 5 years of it was rough. I took care of my mother, and she always thought I was her mother. But she was always, very grateful for anything I did. And she always would say, "Oh, Mother, you're so good to me." That was sad.
Yes.
But she had 5 sisters. 4 of them lived in Newport, and they were very close. My father used to kid them. My mother's maiden name was Smith, and they were very close. And when they'd always get together, my father would say, "Well, there's the meeting of the Smith sisters. I wonder what's going on." But we all had a very happy life, and friends were happy, and it was a nice way of living in those days. Much easier on young people than it is today. We never heard of the drugs or the alcohol, or none of my friends. They didn't smoke. We never had sex problems, or never thought of those things. We were very happy to participate in all the sports.
Did you have parties at home? And
always.
Singing,
piano and singing, and I had an uncle that played the piano, and he used to be invited to all my friends' parties because he played the piano, and we all sang. And my mother and father had lots of parties, and all their friends did, and we always went to them, and we'd be dancing with the husbands of the friends, and it was a very happy time for all of us. And I look back too at one of the things that was nice about families in those days. We seemed to stay more or less around our neighborhood. We did, because my mother would tell us what we could do, and not that we were any different from anyone else, because all my friends were of the same type. We were obedient, and we were told something. We respected our parents, and if they said you're not to go there, we didn't go. You knew better.
Yes.
And I don't ever remember being chastised, and we just knew that you didn't do it. And so we never were with any rough people, or everybody was very nice, and everything was in good spirit and lots of fun. And they used their piazzas a lot in my day.
The piazzas.
Yeah. After dinner every night in the warm weather, in the summertime, I remember my mother and father would always go out and sit on the piazza, and we children would, even as teenagers, we'd sit out there with them when we were that old, but when we were young, we played out in front of them. Mm-hmm. And people always, in those days, which they don't do today, they would visit you, and they'd never call to say they were coming. They'd just come by, and my mother loved it, and my father. They'd come and stop by and come up and sit on the piazza, and then my mother was a very warm, friendly person. She'd always make tea and have something, always baked something, and they'd sit outside and have tea and cake, and then any of the children that were playing would come up, and they always had something for them, cookies, and it was a very happy time for all of us. And I just think today, we live rather a different life, because you can't leave your doors unlocked, and people don't visit you like that anymore. That's a little more
formal.
A little more formal.
Did your house on Rhode Island Avenue have a piazza too?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
so your kids grew up that way.
Yes.
Too.
And my father lived with me the last 5 years of his life after Mother died, and he was a great joy to me. And I think that it's awfully good for children to grow up with grandparents.
Yes.
My children absolutely adored their grandparents. And then they were lucky to have their grandfather live with them 5 years. And I think he was a great influence to them. Mm-hmm. He had wonderful words of wisdom, and they'd listen to him. Mm-hmm. And he used to love to sit on the piazza after his dinner. He'd go out and smoke his cigar out there. Mm-hmm. And he got people used to come up and sit and talk to him, and it was very pleasant for him. But my children absolutely adored him, as they did their grandmother too, but they got closer to him because he lived with us, and you see, Mother was sick for 5 years, so by the time Dad lived with us, and they were growing up, and matter of fact, Peter was in the Marines, but they thought the world of their grandfather, and I think it's awfully good for them, and they had great respect for older people as they grow older, when they have a nice relationship with their grandparents.
It's nice you've got one here.
Yes, I am. I'm delighted to have them.
Going way back to World War I, was there anybody in your family that was involved in the war, or do you remember anybody talking about it, or is it too far back?
Too far. I'm old enough. No, I don't really remember much about World War I. But I do remember World War II very well, and I remember thinking that when, because remember we had, first there was the peace abroad, wasn't that first? And the bells tolled and everything, that the armistice had been signed for that part of the war, and my children were little ones at the time. I can remember waking them up so they'd hear the bells, and then the great one was when the war was over in Japan. Yes. And I was at the beach, and we were all in the water howling and screaming. And of course there was false rumors for a couple of days, and then finally it came. But I always remember wanting to impress upon them that this was the end of that war. And I used to look at the daily news night after night and wonder if I'm ever going to live to see the day that there won't be horrible headlines, the war, but I guess there'll always be wars. But,
how about rationing, Rita? Was it any problem?
Yes, we, the children all had to wear dog tags, so we had to take them, and then the rationing we had for the butter and coffee and toilet paper and paper powder. Oh, there was a lot. My life seemed to be standing in line. And I had a funny story. A very good friend of mine, Helen Tennant, she called me up one day and said, Rita, would you be interested in buying a case of toilet paper? That was something that was very scarce in those days. You were lucky to get 1 or 2 rolls at a time. And I said, well, sure. She said, well, a friend of mine had a funny thing happen. She said she saw an ad in the paper that there was a sale in Jordan Marsh in Boston for toilet paper, and she sent for it. And it said how many sheets, it was saying instead of rolls, it was saying that you were going to get so many sheets. Well, she misunderstood the ad, and she sent for the thing, and when she was a nurse herself, for this friend, and when the order came, she was sleeping because she was on night duty, and her husband came in and woke her up, and he says, will you tell me what in the name of God you've bought? He said, the express company's out here, and they had delivered, I think, 10 boxes or 12 cartons of out on the piazza. And he said, and he gave me a slip and said it was charged to you. So she got out of bed and came out, and she said to the man, oh, there's a terrible mistake. I only wanted 1 or something or 2. So he said, well, no way, this is it. So she came in and she got busy on the telephone calling friends, and I was one of them that I bought 1 of the cartons. And there were loads, I don't know how many rolls, 100 rolls I think you got in a carton. It was a tremendous amount. But then I'm down in the First National store one day across from the City Hall, and I used to do shopping for Mother and myself, and I was in there one day, and you talked to all these strange people, and this man got very pally with me, this old man, and he was very pleasant, and he'd come over and tell me, if you wait around now, there's going to be something come out, and this was the way you lived, and it might be a pound of butter or sugar or something. So this day he said, something's coming out. He thought he had an in. So I got in line, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. We finally moved up, and I got 2 rolls of toilet paper.
That's right. If you saw a line, you stood in it. Right?
Yeah, and I stayed, no matter what, you just stood in them automatically, but sometimes you were lucky and you got something like butter or sugar that you really wanted. But and meat was another thing we had to watch, and believe me, they sold you lots of bad cuts of meat, but you were just so glad to get a piece of meat, you took it. But we didn't suffer, really. We have no complaint here in Newport. Even as you said before, the Depression, I never saw any sign of the Depression here because we didn't have, I think, the mills or anything. In the war, I don't think we suffered that much from it.
There was so much more Navy here during World War II. Did that sort of crowd the Newporters out? Or
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. We were always glad to have them.
Helped the landlords, that's for sure, didn't it? Any volunteer work in World War II for you?
Oh, yes. I used to go up the Robinson House, and that was at the corner of Awell Street and K. And it belonged to a Robinson family, and I think they had a son or somebody that had been killed in the war, but they gave the house to the USO or some such thing, and it was open to all servicemen, and then somebody must have been running it, I don't know, but I was I must have been in my 20s when this was going on, and I remember I used to cook in the kitchen with the sailor boys, and they used to love to make brownies, and we'd make cakes and cookies and everything for whole, on Sundays we'd do this, and I worked at the Red Cross, but we used to have a lot of fun up at and they had dancing everything up there for the boys to entertain them. You'd play cards and we'd write letters for some of them. And
None of your family was in the service.
no, I guess my father was too old with his family or something. I don't really know. He didn't go in the war, and my mother had sisters. There were no. I don't remember that anybody belonged to us was in the. And my children, of course, my brothers were too. No, they went in the service. That was World War II that my brothers were in.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. How about shopping, Rita? Was there, when you lived on Ayrault Street, there weren't any neighborhood stores up there the way there were in the Point, were there?
Oh, right at the corner, at foot of Ayrault Street, we had the most beautiful market in Newport, Tisdale's. It was a beautiful
Broadway.
store,
Yeah.
and it was immaculately kept up, and we had our own, I can remember 3 butchers, Joe Dens, and there was a Mr. Rathkamp and Jack Shea, and we always went to Joe Dens. And as a little girl, I spent my life sitting there with standing at his counter, because he used to bypass me for these other customers, and they'd say, well, that little girl's ahead of me, and he'd say, no, she likes to be here with me, because I
There.
But I used to spend my, every weekend, Mother would give me the list to go down to Joe, well, I guess not only weekends, all the time, and I would stand there. I really learned how to clean a chicken and cut it up. I've watched them do so many, and they did everything in those days, and it was a beautiful market and so well kept up. And in the evening, I guess, I'm trying to remember now whether that would have been every night. Must have been maybe just a couple of times a week, but they would decorate the window and fill it with ice, and then put all their produce there and meat, and very often there'd be a whole pig there with an apple in its mouth and cranberries in its eyes, and it would be a picture, and very often pictures were taken of it. And Roy Hall worked there, and they used to have a fleet of trucks out in front to deliver your thing. And we were talking, not recently, but at one time, of our life, and we were saying how easy things are for us versus parents. My mother didn't have an electric stove at first. She had it in her old, but when I was a little girl, she had a coal stove, and she used to boil the sheets on the thing, and she used to. And the irons were on the stove. I can remember her ironing with them, and I told her all the preserving she did and all this business, and we were talking about it, how easy it is for us, but pushing buttons, everything, all the machines. But one of the friends of mine, her mother, fortunately, is still living, and she said, well, I know, but you girls have to be on the go an awful lot. She said, we had everything brought to the house, more or less. She said we had the milk delivered, the bread, and that was true. Yes. And even when I was first married, Franklin Bakery used to bring the bread, and I had a milkman, and he used to bring eggs to me, and and then the vegetable man used to come by, and he'd go out and look at his beautiful wares, and it was easy. And the Iceman, we had ice on Ayrault Street. I never had that, but the Iceman, you used to put the sign in the window, and he'd bring the piece of ice, and we have to go get everything today, but that's no hardship, really. Whoever invented those supermarkets knew what they were doing, because I go in for a loaf of bread and stagger out.
Yes, that's right.
I don't know why. I must be a compulsive buyer. But I often wonder what the next generation can have, versus what we've had, because when I was a little girl, we had a phonograph that we'd crank up and play. We had a piano that we were lucky enough to have people that knew how to play it, relatives. And but then we had the first radio on Awell Street. And Al said, we'd sit there, and it must have had about 10 dials and a big horn over it, and we'd all be, if it made a squeak, we all were in the absolute excitement that, it made a noise, and then finally it got so that you could get a voice. And I remember well when Al Smith was running during the convention, and they used to line up in my mother's living room in chairs, almost like a theater, and they'd be writing down all these things night after night. Maine votes so many for this one, and I didn't know. I was only a little girl, and all this was going on, but they were greatly excited over it. But then after the radio, they came in, and they were very popular, and then the TV came, and of course, I don't know. At this point, I can't even understand the telephone, how it works.
No, how come you have electricity in the house?
Yeah, but there's been such advances. I suppose the next generation, they'll all be going to the moon for a vacation. It's a wonderful progress. There's something, but you wonder where it's going to progress to next.
Right. What next? What next?
I've been very fortunate in having some wonderful trips. And I like to travel, and I've been lucky, too, to have friends, very nice companions to go with me, and I've seen an awful lot of countries, and it's always nice to come home.
Yes, it is. Rita, your job as social secretary, it's not something that everybody does. How did you, I know you were a regular secretary, but how in the world did you transfer that to the special things you have to do as a social secretary?
Well, I worked at Gustav White's office, and I had learned when I was in New York at school. I told you I went there to St. Catherine's Academy, and then I went to the commercial school they had after for 6 months, and I took a course in secretarial studies, and so I take shorthand and I type. And so it's amazing that an awful lot of girls today do not take shorthand. And as a matter of fact, one of them that I work for, and she's out in Arizona right now, and she lost her secretary, so she had great difficulty getting another one, and she finally got one, but she doesn't take shorthand and she doesn't type, so she has to handwrite letters, which is odd, but I haven't talked to her about it.
But you did so much more than that. You must have had a knowledge of who was who. And
well, I always was interested in the summer people, and because I've lived here all my life, and maybe because of my father's connection with the Whites and everything, I knew who they entertained, and I was always interested. And my mother always brought us up to, well, she was very fussy about our manners, and very fussy that we had nice, gracious living, and she always set a beautiful table, and there was no sloppy way of eating or anything. You ate, and I remember we always had to dress, sit at the table, never come out in a bathrobe. I was an older girl. My mother said, well, you get dressed when you come down. And you did what you were told. Yes. But, and I was interested in, I just started doing it with them, and I asked a lot of questions, and pretty soon you find out who they like to sit with, and I like to hear what they're serving, and then I help them do things like that. And I love my work.
Yeah. How about your relationship with the other people that were working in the houses? Was that friendly, workable?
I don't have anything to do with them, no. They don't bother with me. I mean, we're friendly in that, but they never interfere with me or anything. I do my work, and I've always liked all the help in all the houses that I worked in.
Jennifer asked me to ask you something about Maid's Night Out and the 40 Steps.
Oh, yes, that was a great thing. I think that the help in the houses had a wonderful time years ago, and they used to go to the 40 Steps at night, and there was a man that played a fiddle, and I guess others, anybody that had any kind of a musical instrument, not a piano, of course, but they would bring whatever they could, harmonicas and whatever, and they all danced down there, and they cleared the place, and they had glorious times. And I've heard tales, but I've never known them. The houses always had big parties for their help, and the madam and the head of the house, they'd come down to they might have it in the garage or someplace. And I think they used to call them kitchen rackets. And they would invite people from all the neighboring estates, or any of them, if they knew them, and they'd come over, and they had the heads of the house would come down and see them for a while, but they wouldn't bother them. They'd just pay their respects to them, and greet them. And they had wonderful parties, and they'd have music and food. I think that maybe the food was provided for by the houses. It hasn't happened in my day, but I have heard of them. And I know I worked for the Auchinclosses, and Mr. Auchincloss was a great charmer, Hugh D. Auchincloss, and he used to tell me stories of his aunt building that house over there, Hammersmith Farm. And they were so pleased with it when it was finished that they gave this enormous party for everybody that worked on it.
Oh, gee.
And see, they did things like that. And it was, I suppose maybe they still have parties. I have no idea. I haven't heard. I rather doubt it, though.
Yes.
But they had lots of fun, the people that worked in the houses.
The summer colony people did a lot of other things for Newport, like helping build a hospital and all too, didn't they?
Oh, yes, that's it's not. Oh, it's owned by the city, isn't it? The hospital. I think and of course they've always been very generous to donating when there's a drive on for it. Different, where you can see the names on the rooms and everything.
I'm talking to Rita McCarthy again, and it is now April 4th. Rita, how about the jazz festivals? We haven't talked about those.
I was quite surprised to read in the paper the other night that this was the 30th anniversary of the jazz festival. If you had asked me this last week, I'd probably say 15 years ago. That's how time seems to vanish so quickly. But it said it was the 30th anniversary, and that had something about Wien. And the first one they had here, if I remember correctly, was at the Newport Casino. And we went up to it, and it rained cats and dogs, but we sat through it, and we thought it was kind of exciting to have a festival. It was the first one we had had, and it wasn't overcrowded or anything. But then it didn't take long. I don't think it was another year that it just boomeranged. And I remember how really almost disgusting it got to be, that it then moved down to like Freebody Park, if I'm correct. I haven't even checked on any of these things, but I think from the casino it went down to Freebody Park. And I can remember that we went down of an evening, just, probably 10:30 or 11, just to see what the excitement was. And it was like walking through a field of beer cans. You couldn't move. They were up over your ankles. There were so many of them, just thrown in. It was just devastated. The whole place was a mess. I've never seen anything like it. And then, of course, the sleeping on the beach was terrible, I think, to have allowed it. And I can remember that my husband went down the morning after someone told him that they had come by. They called him up and said they came in from Middletown, and they said, just take a ride down to Newport Beach and Second Beach. You won't believe what you see. It was wall-to-wall people in blankets sleeping all over the place. And I just didn't like what it brought into Newport. I think we didn't need that kind of festival. And I almost felt that was the beginning of dope. I didn't hear of dope at the time, but they were a pretty bad crowd, and I often wondered if that was the beginning of it around here. And then we had the opera festival come, and that was before the music festival, and that was down on King Park. Excuse me, I have a cold. They had an opera festival, and that was quite lovely down on King Park, and I think they had it out on a barge or something. It was quite effective, and fortunately it was a beautiful evening. And quite a crowd of people. And I'm trying to remember if Mrs. James Beck, if she was in charge of it or something. There was some awfully funny story about her Do you remember
I
Mrs.
don't
Beck?
remember Mrs. Beck. Mm.
Well, she was supposed to, I really don't remember if she was the one or not, but anyway, they had the festival down there, and we went to that, and it was lovely, and they had it for a couple of years. And then, of course, how long have we had the music festival?
Well, it must be up to
20 years?
20 years, I think.
And I think that is...
Well, after the awful disaster with the really bad jazz festivals, now that they're back, do you think they are okay and a good thing?
Well, I hope that they won't, overtake us again over Fort Adams in a small way. But I don't know how they limit them, or if it's possible to. But they're over there, and they were all right this time. But you give them an inch, and they take a yard, and so time will tell. I am personally not a jazz fan. I'm not crazy about it, and I wouldn't go across the street, Frank. I did when I was young. I went up to see the first jazz festival, and we went to other ones, but I'm not a jazz fan. But I don't know what the outcome would be. I just hope that it won't be a reoccurrence of that mad mob scenes that come.
How do you feel about the redevelopment in general and the building of the bridge and the ferry going?
Well, I don't like all this redevelopment. I think, for instance, now poor Mr. Shadia that just died, I think what he did to the homes that he bought was magnificent. He never changed the outside appearance of them. He maintained them beautifully and kept them up lovely, and he's a credit. He's a great loss to Newport. I think this other business I read in the paper just last night or the night before, where all those Brenton Cove ones are up for sale if they don't pay some astronomical amount by the 15th of April. They're all going to be sold, and I wonder what's going to happen to all of these condominiums. And they are quite highly priced. I think that what happened in Brenton Cove is a disgrace. That was a beautiful cove, and I think, and especially when I was fortunate enough always to have a friend with a boat that was in there, and it was perfectly beautiful. Now to have these monstrosities, I think it's wicked. And they're so unattractive, and I think the older they get, the worse they're going to look. It's going to look like a ghetto. And I don't like those over at the Newport Country Club from Moreland Farm that hang down. I think I just don't know what the city fathers are thinking of, how they've allowed these things to go on. I just think it's wicked. And I think it's in very poor taste, the houses that have been built around the Ocean Drive. When you get around by past Ridge Road and around there, there's some that are, they're absolutely weird-looking things. They don't belong in the Newport type of home. I think it's terrible. And I think that people, if they're going to build on these choice lots, should submit their design of house, and it should be approved of, and a certain type of house should be built over there, not these things that are going up. It spoils the whole atmosphere of the place. I just don't like it at all.
Well, hopefully, now it's a historic zone, maybe they can have some control over
Well,
what happens.
you say a historic zone. I know for a fact that Antoinette Downing told Mrs. Auchincloss that she didn't ever have to worry about Brenton Cove over there, because that was a historic area and that nothing would ever be built on it.
Oh.
So what happened?
So what happened, yeah.
So you can't believe anything.
No.
So it's sad, because we'll never get them back again.
Do you think the bridge, opening the city up to make it more accessible was largely...
Well, that's the root of all evil. When you make a place easily accessible, then you get the mob scenes coming in, and I think we have far too many people for the size of the city we have. I think that tourism is great to a certain degree, but I think that I don't like to go down Thames Street in the summertime and see the people milling around. It looks like Coney Island. So I don't know what, the outfits they have on, and they're milling around. I wonder if they bring any money in. I understand a lot of them are brown paper, what do they call them, brown baggers or something?
Yes, brown baggers.
That they don't even buy food. And of course it is expensive for a family to come into a place and try to feed them all, but I just don't like to see them. There's too many people.
How about America's Cup, Rita?
Oh, I think that's marvelous. I think that was a wonderful thing for Newport. It brings a tremendous amount of money, and it was good sportsmanship up until this year, which is sad. But there's an awful lot of money spent on them, and nobody goes into it. It's like J.P. Morgan said, if you ask how much it costs, you shouldn't be in it. But those boat races I wouldn't even venture a guess at what it costs for anybody to participate in the trials and that. When you think of, they eat terrifically at those places. I was always fascinated to be up in Almax or the A&P and watch the basket loads of food that would be going out for these houses where they feed the crews and everything. And they were a nice group of people, and I think the Australians endeared themselves to Newport. They were a wonderful group, and if any country was going to win, I was glad that they did, because they had great courage coming back year after year after year. And I think it was very nice that they're the ones that got the cup in the end. Someone had to have it.
Yeah, how about there were some of the houses right down the street here from you that were rented by syndicates for their crews?
Oh, yes.
Would they make good summer neighbors?
Oh, they were no bother at all. Not at all. Although I've been told by the owners of the house that the houses weren't left in that great condition, but they got a very, very good price for it that they would never get if it wasn't a cup race. And if you got that kind of money for the house, and you have that many people staying in your house, well, what do you expect? They get a lot of wear and tear, so you got to take the bitter with the sweet. No, but they never were noisy or rowdy or anything. Didn't mind them at all.
Did you go out and watch any of the races?
Oh, yes, I went to. Every time we had the races, I always went out. I think they're very boring to watch. I like the spectator fleet. I think that's fascinating. But to go out there and it's like watching grass grow, but it's so colorful, and to see all the spectator fleet. And when you think of really the cheapest boat of any kind that's got a motor in it, I guess they must cost about $5,000, and you see them out there and they're $5 million. Gorgeous boats, and a lot of money spent around here. It's a loss financially, I think. Great loss.
Did the summer colony do a lot of entertaining for
Oh, yes. And they liked them very much. They got involved with them, and there were certain ones that they liked, but they entertained them, and the ambassadors when they came over, and they all. And I don't know how they survived the summers with the yacht races. The parties were party on top of party, but they were very active with all these summer people.
Dinner parties and things.
Dinner parties and dances and you name it, and they did it with them. Everything.
Coming back, before we wind this up, to the good old days of the Fall River Line, Rita, you wrote it.
That was a bit of disappointment to me when the Fall River Line closed down, because I thought it was a delightful way of going to New York, and we used it many times, and it was so cheap. I think your stateroom was $1.50 or something, and your ticket was probably, I don't know, $4 or $5. It was very cheap, and they had very good food on board. And you'd go on board here at Newport at 9 o'clock, and you'd be in New York at 7 in the morning, and it was just beautiful. A lovely cruise all the way down, and as a matter of fact, my mother and father, when they went on their honeymoon, they went on the maiden voyage of the Commonwealth.
Did they? Oh, when was that? When were they married?
November 6, 1907.
Oh, gee.
So, but it was a delightful way of going to New York. And then in New York, it was very pretty leaving. I think you left at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and if it was in the fall of the year, you'd get the beautiful all the lights on in the lower Wall Street area, and that it would be to see the New York Harbor at night was perfectly lovely, and you'd have your dinner on there, and the food was so cheap and delicious. It was lovely, it was maintained in great style, and but I guess it just didn't make money. Another thing a lot of us used to do is go up to Fall River and get a ride up, or go up in a trolley car and get on the Fall River line and come down from there to Newport. Get off when you got here. You'd have your supper on the way down. It was in
Really?
Yeah.
Good.
And it was like nothing to do it, price. But it was just fun to do it, a group of us.
That's right.
And it was sad when they closed down, because it was a nice way of traveling. And in the summertime, lots of times in the evening, I can remember we'd take a ride down to the end of Long Wharf to see the boat come in, and we'd watch the summer people leaving.
Uh-huh.
And they'd all be going back to New York on the boat, and it would be loads and loads and loads of fish, barrels of fish being piled onto the boat. It was quite exciting to see it. But I hated to see it go. It was really a very nice way of traveling. And
did they run all winter too? It wasn't just
oh
summertime.
yes, no, it went all the time.
All the time.
I guess if it was a bad storm, maybe they wouldn't go. But I don't think we ever had many terrible storms like that. But it seemed to go all the time that I knew of, and we used it quite a lot. But it was a sad blow when it quit.
Yes, and so suddenly too. It's a
Yeah.
shame. Well, Rita, I can't thank you enough for doing all this, spending this time and telling us all your good stories and all. And we will.
I'm sorry I didn't give it more thought in the beginning when you asked me, and then really get it organized instead of
just fine,
hodgepodge.
fine and dandy. And I do thank you very, very much.